This is Dan Henk with another Skull Session podcast. Today, my guest is Stephanie Ellis, and she's an author. She's going to tell us what she's working on right now and a little bit of her history. So, what's your latest project, Stephanie?
I've got a couple of things on the go. One is more than a couple of things. One is a novel that I've just finished. It's a dark historical fiction one. It's a bit more mainstream than what I've written in recent years, and I've just finished that, and I'm going through before I send it out to readers. It's set in 1649 during the English Civil War, and features witchcraft and Puritans and all that sort of thing, and my family history, because I'm a great big sort of genealogy buff and I love tracing my family back. And I've gone back to the Plantagenets and Alfred the Great and the Vikings and all that. But
Nice.
in 1649, my ancestors in Lancashire were amongst the first Quakers. And I thought I'd like to write a bit more about them, because wherever I look for my family, yes, some of them go into royalty, but others, they're the nonconformists, the people who did their own thing. And I think that appeals to me a little bit more at times than maybe getting into a major royal family. That and the Vikings, I like the Vikings. So that's one novel. I'm working on a novella in verse at the moment with Shane Douglas Keane. Not saying too much about what that is because it's a little bit. I'm not sure that I should even have mentioned it, actually. It's a little bit hush hush. She'll tell me off later. We have worked on a project before. We wrote Lilith Rising a little while ago, and that's out. And that's a novella in verse, and it seemed to work out quite well. So we're doing something again, but that is quite different, and that is ongoing. I've just received edits back for The Woodcutter, which is a folk horror novel, which is out in June of 2023. And I've started thinking about my next novel in the folk horror series, Five Turns of the Wheel. So I had Five Turns of the Wheel, Reborn, which came out October, and now I'm going to write another one. So I built a world, and I think if you build a world, you spend a lot of time creating characters, creating atmosphere and environment. You don't want to just leave it. You've done all that work, keep them, bring them back and get them doing all sorts of other horrible things. So I've got all that on the go, as well as some work over at Horror Tree, which is admin stuff and indie bookshelf posts, things like that. So I do that as well.
So, you have a lot of projects going on all at once. Like,
Yeah,
how do you manage what's priority and what has to be worked on at the very moment?
I'm a bit rubbish at that as well, actually, because I'm also a mentor on the HWA program, and that's just started recently as well. So I tend to, if that comes in, I'll prioritize that. If I've got deadlines, like The Woodcutter, those edits need to be done. So I'm getting those done in the next few days. But after that, then in theory, I'm free, apart from the routine work with Horror Tree that I do each week. But I find that the more free time I have, the worse it gets with writing. When I was working full time until a couple of years, must be about 2 years ago now, I was a teaching assistant in a secondary school over here and a librarian and literacy specialist working with teens. And I was writing in my free time and finding I had no time. And we made a decision because of COVID. It makes you reevaluate things. I don't know whether you were hit the same way at all. I mean, I worked through most of it being in the educational side, but I just wanted to get out and get away. The pressure was a bit too much. So my husband said, if you want to write full time, go for it. And he'll carry on working. So yeah, he's out at work at the moment so he can pay the bills. So we got rid of the mortgage. We've moved back near family. And so in theory, I had all this free time. And it's like when you tidy the house and you make space for things, it just fills up again. It's been terrible. But I do make myself work. I have to have a little bit of pressure, I think. A little bit of stress gets me to do the work.
Like
But
some
otherwise,
deadlines.
yeah, because otherwise I'll go off and think, oh, I need to clean the bathroom, or I'll have another cup of tea, and I
Right.
put the work aside, or I'll do my puzzle for the day to keep my brain going. But or I'll read a book. I do like to read a lot, but when I read, that pushes me back to writing as well. So if I'm losing not interest, but the urge to write, I'll go and read, and then I think, yeah, I love reading. I'll go back and write my own. So it's a two-way thing. but I can manage when I need to. Most of my life has been deadlines. I was a tech author for many years, and we were in the private sector, and I project managed as well, and that was all budgets and deadlines, and you have to do this and you have to do that. So I can do it when I have to.
Yeah, I find that being like an artistic atmosphere definitely helps. I mean, COVID here, we actually locked down for 3 months. And then after
Mm,
that, like people were allowed to come in by, like I run tattoo studios as well. So people were
yeah.
allowed to come in by appointment, wearing a mask, and we could work on them that way. But what I tend to do is I tend to only do 3 days tattooing, and all the rest I do writing and art. But I go
Yeah.
into the shop because it's an artistic environment. Like
Yeah.
we have horror movie posters framed everywhere, and it's like it just feels like it's a place you go to work. So I feel like I get more done, than if I like stayed home and like I
Mm.
put a documentary on TV. I'm like, oh, I have food here, I have documentary here, but it's like you just don't get as much done. I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I've got my three adult kids at home. They've all sort of recently finished uni, so we're all together in the one house. So my visions of having a little room as an office haven't quite materialized yet. For years, my writing was done on a corner of the settee in the front room with everything going on around me. But now I've got a little corner. Where I am now is a corner of my bedroom with my desk, with books, with my bookshelves. And when I sit here, and I've got a large drawing tablet next to me as well. So when I sit here, it does feel a bit more like work. And when I'm formatting or editing or proofreading, because I do some of that as well for Brigid's Gate Press, I've got the two screens, and I will get on and do it until I decide to see what's on YouTube or something like that.
I don't know. It seems like it would be very distracting, if you were like in the front room and you have the kids and you have, all this commotion going on and everything. How are you able to focus? How are you able to concentrate?
It's just the way I've always had to do it. Before we moved, we were in a small terraced house down in the south of England, and with a family of five with kids running about. I didn't really write until they were older, but it still meant I didn't have space to write. But I just got used to it, I think, because when I read as well, I tend to zone out of everything around me. So
Right.
apart
So
from the
you put
house
yourself in
literally
your
going
own
up, yeah,
zone. Yeah.
yeah, unless it's going up in flames, I can shut things out. And that has really helped a lot, I think. So I can sort of shut noise out. And I do like to, unless it's something that I choose to allow in, like music. If I'm writing, I will put music on at times, depending what sort of mood I want to create. I use music to get into the right frame for whatever atmosphere I'm setting. If it's folk horror, the woodcutter is, I keep saying this, the woodcutter has this creature, and it's a sort of giant creature,
That's your folk
mythological.
horror novel?
It's a folk horror, but I was trying to imagine him, and I had a certain image in my head, but he was walking through these woods, and I couldn't quite get it. I wasn't quite in the right place to write, and that was the time. That Behemoth came out with their version of The Cure's A Forest, and I put that on, and I watched the video, and I thought, yeah, I'll take those sort of twig things that they're wearing around the necks, and I'll put that on my sort of monster creature, and it put me in the right sort of frame. And I had that track on a loop while I was writing events happening in the woods, and all the sort of the darkness that was emerging there. So sometimes the tracks can actually take me to the right place to do the writing. I know a lot of people or a lot of writers say they don't like noise, or they'll get distracted by lyrics.
Yeah,
And my
that's
other
me.
answer,
Yeah.
but listen to your Finnish or your Scandinavian metal. You can't
Right.
understand a word they're saying. Same with Rammstein, although you can get the drift with them half the time. There's some German stuff I listen to, but if it's foreign lyrics, that's not going to distract you too much.
But even the vocals, like the vocals are almost like if you listen to death metal or something, almost like another instrument. So it's like just the fact that there are a bunch of instruments, it creates, like, maybe I checked it too much in my head,
Yeah,
but it's like I tend to focus on that when I should be focusing. Like whenever I do a novel, I try to almost like pretend like I'm there, like it's happening all around me, like try to involve myself as much as
yeah.
possible. I feel like that's the most realistic approach to it. Like
Yeah.
if the character sees something, I see something. If the character reacts a certain way, either I react that way or I know somebody who reacts that way. But then I for me personally, that needs to all be going through my head. I need to be experiencing it. If like in the background, like Neurosis or Clutch or somebody is playing, it's like I'll be distracted.
Yeah, I get that because you're talking about the way I write. It's like I say, it's sitting behind their eyes. So as soon as you
Right.
create this character, you're there in their head. But I use the music rather than let it distract me too much. And most of the time, as I say, it's either to set the atmosphere or the mood of the person, the character in the story. They might be, whether it's the anger or the energy, I take that element of it and use that to drive the writing, and that really pushes you on. There is certain music I use for editing, which is a bit calmer, but when it's mood music, I will use it that way, and not it's more the music I think than the lyrics. I've learned to tune those out to a certain extent, but as I say, if it's a foreign language, then I don't worry too much about it. But like you, as soon as I've created this character, because I don't have an outline, I don't work to an outline, I'm very much a pantser. I have this person or this creature and I'm there. And as soon as they start moving, I'm with them,
I
and then I
just
just
heard that recently. The term pantser, like now, is I know it means seat of the pants, as opposed to like an extensive outline. But I was like, pantser, what's a pantser?
it took me a couple of years. I think back in the day when I first thought, oh, I might try something, a longer piece of fiction, I did try an outline and I created these characters and I was describing them in this notebook like some people do, and a map of this village and everything else and all this detail and what I wanted to happen. And I started writing and it was too restrictive, and the characters, they just wouldn't do what I wanted them to. So now I'll just think of something will come to me. I think, oh yeah, I'd like to see what happens here. And then I just let them go with it. I don't know what's going to happen in the story. I'll know the genre that I want to write, the sort of area, the place, and I'll get them in there and they'll be off. And I just don't really know what's going to happen. And then about 3/4 of the way, I'll realize there's an ending. It'll come to me. And then I
Right.
just head off that way. All sorts of things happen and they're not planned. I think Five Turns of the Wheel, which is a folk horror novel, there is a certain structure in there because it's based around rituals, some rituals I created. So I use those to guide my characters through. But generally it's just, well, wind them up and see what happens. A lot
Why
of
do you call it
mayhem.
five turns of the wheel? What's
Uh,
significance of that name? The five turns of the wheel.
oh right, yeah. The Five Turns of the Wheel. The Five Turns is actually is the name of the pub where in the village where it's set, and the wheel is effectively the circle of, or the cycle of life. And there's a ritual each year, and they call it the Five Turns. Although there's a sixth turn, but there's 5 rituals in that take place in 5 villages, and then on the sixth turn, the sixth night, it goes into the village. This ritual happens at the village that's in the center of this particular area, so it's like a wheel. So in this country, well, it's in England, a little corner of rural England, and you've got this village called Cropso, and then there's 5 other villages around it, like spokes of a wheel. And when rituals happen, they go from Cropso to each of the villages in turn. So it's turning round. And those rituals will take life of one or other person from each of these villages according to the rhyme, which I can't remember off the top of my head. I made it up, but I won't repeat it here. But yeah, so I create all these rituals, and then it's usually the women who are the ones at the receiving end. They're the ones who are controlled in this very rural part of it. It is modern day England, but it's kept away from modern life. So for these people to for them to have a decent harvest, for them to thrive, they have to give these other creatures from this other world their blood, their bodies if need be. And but somebody decides to actually break the hold of these creatures on this particular corner of the world. And whether they do or not, you'll have to see in the story. But if you know that some of them are returning in Reborn, it didn't work quite as well as you hoped. But it's folk horror, but it's partly based on my own childhood, which isn't horror, I should say. But I grew up in the Cider House, which is a pub in the middle of nowhere in Shropshire, which is a rural county in England. And I was feeling a bit nostalgic for those times. And I decided to write a folk horror that was set in that environment, which I grew up in. Some of the regulars are there, but you wouldn't recognise them as I've changed them a little bit. And I thought I'd just have a bit of fun within that particular environment. I really like at the moment writing stories that involve the landscape, that involve ritual, and it's a sort of reconnecting with the past a little bit. I mean, yes, it's nice that I'm not actually the one on the receiving end of any of this, but I do love that element of past traditions coming back to life in a way in the present time, and twisting those old religions and rituals and seeing where it takes you. And Reborn, which is the follow-up, is a little bit like that, but it goes further back into Old English sort of Viking ritual a little bit. So I'm using these books as a way to research traditions and rituals in this country, maybe bearing in a bit of my Viking heritage, perhaps.
Oh yeah, so my ancestors are Vikings too. Some of your ancestors are Vikings. Yeah.
Yeah, I was quite lucky because there's a name in my family tree, Praetor, which is actually a Norman name. And then through the Normans, you can go back to the Vikings if they're mentioned in wills and land records, things like that. If you're more of a common ancestry, I've got blanket weavers in Oxfordshire that go back about 300 years, but I can't get any further than that. But with some of the Norman branches, I've gone back quite far in a proven way. I know that there are some Americans who are linked into my tree, and they say, oh, we're related to this person and to that person. And I've looked at it. I thought, no, you're about 100 years out there. So I've gone off a different way and checked all the records and thought, yeah, we are, but in a different route. So I've got all sorts in my tree.
Everybody in the US is a mishmash. You know, we're all from somewhere else. We just we're end up here.
Yeah, we're probably related because if you go back so far, I say, oh, William the Conqueror's in our family tree. And everyone goes, what? But so many millions of other people are as well. I haven't done anything as far. Who was it? Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun? One or the other is supposed.
80% of the population has some of Genghis Khan's genes in them.
Yeah, well, I haven't found that link yet.
So why do you call it a folk horror novel? Is it like part of the tradition used, part of the tropes, the stereotypes, the like ancestry, the atmosphere? What's going on?
It's the atmosphere and the land. It very much fits into what people regard as folk horror. When they talk about folk horror, they talk about the Wicker Man or the blood on Satan. I'm going to get it wrong now. The blood on Satan's claw. I got the name wrong on another interview and said the blood on the devil's hand.
Did you see the movie The Wicker Man?
But the blood on Satan's claw. So these are all sort of where you have old rituals in a deserted part of the countryside, and you have strangers coming in and things happen. But it's as I say, it's very much past tradition being brought into the present. And one thing, apart from my own growing up in the countryside, that drew me to this was the Wicker Man. And I have not watched the Nicolas Cage version. I am not going to watch it.
Don't watch it. The first one's awesome. Yeah.
My eldest daughter, she keeps telling me, you must watch it, Mum. I go, no.
Well, maybe you want to laugh. You want comedy,
I'm not going to watch it because the 73 one for me was the thing. And there's a part in there where they have the parade with the hobby horse, and you've got Christopher Lee as the half man, half woman, and you've got Punch, and you've got all these characters, but they look really evil. They're quite grotesque. So even though it's supposed to be fun, it looks frightening. And I love that element of folk tradition. If you look at old photographs of places in this country, and when they're dressed up to do their Morris dancing, or there's one which has, I can't remember what it's called. I don't know whether it's Abbott's Head, and they have these stag antlers around their neck, and they do all these dances. It can be really creepy. And I wanted to bring Mama's Troops like that into the stories and to turn them into something that aren't quite as friendly or as entertaining as people think, although they're entertaining in another way. But yeah, folk horror, as I say, it's isolation, it's landscape, it's tradition. usually rural, but you can have folk horror in a city setting. I
Well, it seems
haven't
like you
tried
get
it
a lot
yet.
of like you get a lot of like local tradition based off the huge mishmash of cultures we all have. Like, have you
Yeah.
read Clive Barker's The Tale of Two Cities?
I have not read that. Everyone keeps telling me I should read
Yeah,
him. I
it's
haven't read him.
great.
I have read Dickens' version of Tale of Two Cities and cried at the end, but I haven't read that.
Well, Clive Barker is really. I mean, he wrote this like before he was doing full novels, he was doing short stories, and
Yeah,
he compiled them in the Books of Blood series. And
yeah,
I think there are 6 volumes of that out, and each one has a short story collection. But it's like each short story is like 30 pages or less, and The Tale of Two
yeah,
Cities is one of those. It's only like 30 pages or less, I believe, but it's a really good novel. It's really a tale. I advise checking it out, and you probably find be along the lines of what you're writing with because it takes like a local tradition, and you can kind of see how horrific it can be,
yeah.
but for the locals it's like that's just what happens.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is in my 5 turns until someone gets a bit fed up with it and changes it. But I have been searching out all sorts of folk horror novels if I can, because I think it is a very much um, overlooked genre. I think people say, "Oh, I love folk horror," but then they don't seem to read it as much, or they don't look out for it, or it doesn't seem to garner the same attention as maybe the splatter side does. But
Well, I think it's the basis of better stories, actually.
mm,
Like I think the strongest horror stuff that holds up is the stuff that has a good, strong story behind it.
yeah.
If you look at Pumpkinhead, that was a great movie. If you look at Wicker Man, that was a great movie. Like any movie where it's like that's the tradition of the local people, or
Mm.
that's what they participated in, and it evolves into a complex event that maybe has elements of horror, I think that's way stronger than gore in your face.
Yeah, it's like Shirley Jackson's Lottery the short story, and that's the same sort of thing. As you find out what's going on at the end, it's exactly that. So that's the short story that I would recommend. I don't know whether you've read that one,
No, I have
um,
not.
but there's also Harvest Home by Thomas Trowne is one that I've read, and reading that, everything is that's another aspect I like about folk horror. You get the setting, it's so idyllic, it can be pastoral, and you go along and see these picket fences, everything's perfect, and but underneath or just behind the scenes something's not right, and as you go through it still
I think
feels
that makes it
really
way
nice.
creepier than like,
Yeah, and
gore
then
in
when
your
you get
face.
yeah, so when you get to the ending and you discover exactly what's been going on, it's a real punch, and it affects you more than a lot of what I would say in your face horror.
Yeah.
One thing I would recommend when I was talking about The Wicker Man, this is another thing I tell people, is to buy or read the novel, get the hold of the novel, which was written by the scriptwriter and the director, I think. And it came out after the movie. So it ties in. So it's by the real writers. And as you read it, you get more of a feeling for poor old Sergeant Howie, and you realise what sort of person he is. Because as you watch the film, you see this sort of priggish, uptight bloke, and yeah, you feel sorry for him at the end of The Wicker Man when he's burning. But you read the book and you find out what he's thinking inside and how his ideas change. And then at the end, and this is a spoiler for the novel, although people might say, oh, it's not really a spoiler. But there are animals in that Wicker Man with him, and even though he's suffering and he's starting to burn, what really got me, and it gets me now as I think about it, was he was leaning over where he could and freeing those animals so that they wouldn't burn with him. And that showed how, there's a level of courage that is built up for him throughout the book, which you don't necessarily see in the film as he goes stomping about.
Yeah,
So where you
definitely.
can,
What were the animals?
pardon? Oh,
What were the animals?
it was chickens, that sort of thing, small animals that could fly away,
Okay.
birds and that. But I think, from what I can remember, he was a vegetarian, I think. But he didn't want those animals harmed, and he freed them. But that isn't done in the film, from what I remember, or that aspect of his
Yeah, I don't remember
compassion.
any of that in the film. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's just another little aspect, and that's why I prefer books to films most of the time, because you often find another extra layer in there, or reason for a person's actions.
Oh,
I know
definitely.
a lot of horror writers will talk about all the films they've watched, and then they'll turn around and say, "Have you seen this?" I go, "No, I do watch horror films. I've watched some, but I've not watched all of them." I went through a phase in the 80s, and showing my age now, when all the films came out, you first, when Poltergeist, The Thing, The Entity, when they came out, I'd go off to the cinema and watch them week in, week out. Whatever was on, I'd watch it. And then I stopped later on when I had kids. I found I couldn't really watch horror to a certain extent. And these days, I will watch some, but it's got to have an appeal, a story for me to watch it. But I much prefer the books. So I will read a bit of dark fiction, and I prefer my own imagination to work things out rather than watch maybe your slasher films. If
Or a
I'm trying to write
mediocre
some,
interpretation. Yeah.
yeah. I haven't seen any of the slasher films. My eldest is a big horror fan, and she's watched the Saw films and everything like that, and I haven't watched
Yeah,
any
I'm
of
not a
those
huge
yet.
fan of the Saw films. I remember I've always been kind of known as like the horror guy, like when I worked at tattoo parlors, and people would come in, they're like, I remember one guy came in and he's like, "Oh, you've seen this movie? It's the most horrific movie ever. You've got to watch this." And it was Saw, like the director's cut or whatever. And so when somebody talks it up, and you think, they've already elevated it to such a level
Mm,
that when you watch it, you're like, yeah, all right. I mean, it's not bad, but the greatest ever. This is not a horror fan that told me this.
yeah.
So I don't know. I'm not. Maybe that tainted my vision of the Saw films, but yeah, I'm not a huge fan.
Yeah, I'm watching Alice in Borderland at the moment. The second series has just come on to Netflix over here. There's some Korean horrors and things. Again, it's through my eldest. She shares a lot of things with me, and I'll watch or read or listen to what she suggests. Sometimes it's a few years down the road, and she's, "Oh, you're finally watching it then?" Yeah. But yeah, we having kids or having sort of young adults around, it keeps you in touch with what's coming out these days, so you don't stay as sort of
Was
stuck in a
currently
rut.
popular, and yeah.
Yeah, yeah, although she says she's getting a bit older now because she doesn't understand half the words my younger daughter comes out with.
I will say, going back, and someone mentioned the thing. I actually read the novel the thing is based off of. It's called Who Goes There? And
Yeah.
the thing is one of those rare occasions where I thought the movie was way better than the book. There was the source material. But like if you like watch American Psycho, the book is way better, it's way more complex, way more
Yeah,
involved. Like you feel the character, the strength of
yeah.
the character. Same with a whole slew of novels. I don't even want to get into them all because there's so many where the novel just has so much more depth to it.
Mm. 'Cause I was reading Psycho, and when you have the you watch the film, and the description of the characters in it doesn't match what's in the book,
Right.
you know.
That always bothered me. Yeah.
And I was thinking, oh, that's different. Maybe I shouldn't have read the book this time. But I do like to see, because everyone says, oh, these are classics, you need to read them. I think I read The Exorcist not so long ago for the first time. It's again, it's like I write horror and dark fiction, and everyone thinks that you've read every horror book out there. So they'll be saying, "Have you read this? Have you read that?" And I'll be going, "No, no." So I have been catching
Maybe
up a
some
little
of the
bit.
classics, but it would be almost impossible to read everything out there these days.
It would. No, I tried to be at first when I was starting. You felt you had to read all these things, so you tried to get through as many as possible. But now I've sort of slowed down a bit, and I'll be a bit more choosy about what I want to read. Um, I read a lot of indie authors still, whether it's for review or it's beta reading, or that it's people I know their books are out, and I'll get those and I'll read them. But I also have some favorite authors as well, and I'll pick up anything of theirs. Grady Hendrix I love because he's a dark writer, but there's humor, and I love humor in it. Adam Neville, I like his work, and There's another one, John Alvi. I can't say his name. Lindqvist. Let the right one in. I've got his books because there's a sort of supernatural element in there that's not necessarily hot. It's dark, but it takes you away from what I call the in-your-face horror. There's more atmosphere, so I'll pick and choose a little bit about what I read now, and not beat myself so much that I'm keeping up with everybody else. Because I think people, as writers, you worry a bit too much that maybe you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. But now I'm getting on a bit. I'll just do my own
Have
thing.
you read any Neil Gaiman?
Yes, I have. I've got his on a shelf over there. American Gods, Neverwhere.
Yeah.
I've got a few of them up on the shelf. That was a few years back, but
I
I've
feel
kept them.
like originally I wanted to be a comic artist and I'd read his stuff in Sandman.
Yeah.
And he was talented, but he didn't like blow me away. Like Alan Moore is one of my favorites, you know.
Oh, I've got his Jerusalem.
Oh, how'd you
Have
like
you
it?
read that? Have you read it?
No, I've not read it. I read pretty much all of his comic book stuff, and I did his like 6-hour writer seminar and stuff, but
Oh,
I have not read Jerusalem.
yeah, I think that's about the only thing I've read of his, but I do mean to read more. But it's this great big thick book, and I just saw it in Waterstones, and it was lying there. And I love really big books to read. I like to get lost. I mean, a lot of the posts and tweet people say, "Oh, no one's got the attention span to read these books these days. It's got to be a novella. It's got to be short. You know,
Well,
there's
I
no
actually
place."
like that. I know a lot of people don't, but I like that like older version, like Lucifer's Hammer. I don't know if you read it, but it's like people are like, oh well, so like it's about a giant meteor that slams to the earth. And there's this apocalypse and all this stuff, but it spends like the first like 100 something pages building up the characters. So
Yeah,
when the meteor slams into the earth, then you see the dramatic change.
yeah.
I like that
But I
better.
love, yeah, I love those sort of things. So if there are any writers out there who do write these really long books, keep at it. There are readers like us waiting for them. But that Jerusalem one, it was just a chunky read, and I really feel the need to read that sort of length books at times. I can't just keep reading short stories or anything else. I have to get those books. So Jerusalem was one of my summer reads, and then obviously there's The Stand, Stephen King's, Chuck Wendig's books I like because they're long ones. There's Todd Kiesling's Devil's Creek. Recently I've just read Babel, which is more a sort of fantasy type thing, and Stephen King's Fairy Tale. But again, those are nice long books, and I can just forget about the world when that happens. So yeah, please keep writing those longer books.
Well, Stephen King, like I think he has some great elements, but he's not one of my favorite writers. Like I
Mm.
think a lot of his characters and scenes are very realistic, but some of the stories, especially towards the end, they kind of trail off for me.
Yeah, I had I think it was Revival, I can't remember. And I was really enjoying the story. And then I think at the end, these insects appeared, these ants or something. It's it's like a curtain was pulled aside and there was all
Right.
these ants and or some sort of insect in there. And it's that sort of odd ending that I don't always like. I don't like all of his books. But as you say, when he gets into the detail of the town and the characters, that's another way for me to escape. Sometimes you need that level of detail to just go completely into another world. And most of his books I like that way, but not all of them. But The Stand is one that I like because it's sort of post-apocalyptic, and I like that type of story as well.
Yeah, well, what I was gonna say, like with Neil Gaiman, is like his original self, like American Gods, was I think one of his first actual novels. Before that, he did like the Sandman and other comic book stuff.
Mm.
But I felt like he was a good author, but he wasn't a great author. But he's kind of evolved, so more and more, like he can almost write about anything, and it just sounds good. Like
Yeah,
his latest book, I think The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which I
yeah,
read. I was like, this is so well written, so smooth. So
yeah.
it's kind of like it's probably the way Shakespeare was perceived, long ago. Like
Mm.
it's a little bit more lyrical and it speaks to you.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, obviously wasn't around at the time of Shakespeare, but yeah, no, that's what I feel.
I'd love to be able to come up, I mean, I'm not going to say churns them out because I think churn is the wrong word. It does a disservice to the writer. but he is able to just keep getting the stories out, whether it's Neil Gaiman or Stephen King, whatever. They just keep coming out with these brilliant ideas, and I think one day that'll happen to me. I think my ideas are good, and I think my writing's okay. I'd like more people to read them.
I think the whole folk horror genre, one, is one that's not explored as much anymore, and I really miss it because I think it provides some really strong stories, and I also think it's a little bit unique. It's something that hasn't been like delved into and beaten to death like zombies.
Yeah, it seems to be one of those that bubbles up, and everyone says, "Yeah, this is the next thing," and then it sort of fades away a little bit. So it's sort of bubbling under all the time. But I don't just write. I mean, folk horror is one love of mine. I do gothic horror, although that tends to be what I term sort of East End gothic. Again, ancestors in the East End of London at that sort of time, living in some of the
It's kind of
most
like the Interview with the Vampire Lestat sort of vibe to it for the gothic stuff.
it's more about the streets of London, Jack the Ripper sort of element. He's there in the background, but he's not the feature of the story. There's a sort of supernatural element to it. But again, that allowed me to explore my East London ancestry. And if you look at the history of London, there are some records from, oh, I can't remember. There are these poverty maps that were drawn at the time in the late 1800s, and I traced my family to these streets around Whitechapel and Spitalfields and Bethnal Green, all those sort of areas, and they were in the poorest streets. And so I was able to do a bit of research again and bring in some of my family names into these books. I've got a novella that's out on submission at the moment, and it uses some of my family, some of the Collins family that I found that were in that area, and I was able to sort of explore their lives a little bit. So there's always a little bit of me in some manner or other in some of these stories. And then I did a bio horror with Paused, and that was set in my old town old city where we used to live, Southampton, and it was exploring what would happen if everybody had this locked-in syndrome. I don't know if you ever read about it.
The locked-in syndrome? No, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, it's where the body is unresponsive, but the brain is still functioning. They're still aware, and those in
That
hospital
sounds like the premise of a number of horror movies. Yeah.
Well, this. So if someone wants to turn my book into a movie, they can do. It's a short one, but lots of scope.
If Hollywood comes calling,
But locked-in syndrome, I mean, in the hospitals, some of them can communicate by blinking their eyelids, things like that. But I was just wondering what would happen if somehow humanity or people started to actually go about their day-to-day business and then suddenly freeze because this affected them in some way. I'm not saying whether it's a virus or not. It is like a pandemic, but whether it's a virus or whether it's genetic, again, you'll have to read. But it stops people where they are and they cannot respond in any way. So you could have been crossing a railway track and then you freeze and you can do nothing except watch the train come towards you. You could be walking on a beach and the tide is out, but then you freeze. You can't do anything if there's no one around and the tide comes in and you drown.
right.
So yeah, I've got people trying to discover what caused it and how to cure it within the book, but it's also about how other people respond to those that they see around them who have frozen or paused. And part of that is when you see accidents on the news or attacks, whatever, there's always this group of people who are filming and taking advantage of what's going on. And I was sort of exploring that element about, would you go and help someone? Would you just film them and put the film up on whatever platform you use? Or would you, if that person was completely vulnerable, would you do something to them? Would you help them or would you do something awful? And so there's elements of that within the story. And when I started to write it, I thought this is going to be quite difficult because if everybody stops, how do you move your story along?
Right.
So
I think it's a clever turn. Kind of reminds me of like 28 Days Later, where there's like something that all of a sudden affects everyone.
Yeah. And I actually read something recently in the paper exploring the possibility of humans having once hibernated, maybe something in the genetic makeup. And I was thinking, I touched on that
Like
in my
around the
novel.
Ice Age or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So I've sort of hinted at that within that book before I even read that story. And I thought, oh, yeah, so I've got something right for a change, possibly. Who knows? But yeah, it was quite fun to write because that was started before the actual pandemic. So it wasn't COVID that triggered it. It was something that I was actually just writing at the time. And I just wanted to see what would happen following it through, because to be in that position, I thought that must be awful. So I have shown some people doing awful things whilst others are doing what is in theory the right thing. But I kept it within this one family. So you'd have the doctor and his team trying to find a cure, but then his family are experiencing these aspects of the condition outside. So there's a way of linking them and moving the story through, forward that way, because I couldn't tell it all from the doctor's point of view. There's no sort of movement, there's no story arc, it's just people freezing. So that was the answer to that particular difficulty.
This is a book that you currently have out, or a book you're working on?
It's one that's out. It's a novella. It's paused. It's out with Bridget's Press. It came out this time last year with Silver Shamrock. That particular press went and closed around March. That was a bit of a difficult time. But I knew the publishers at Bridget's, and this was before they'd actually created a press. And they said they'd like to see my work, and they'd read some of it already, and they really liked it anyway. So they gave my work a home. And as I say, they're putting out my new book that's coming out, The Woodcutter, that FOCO that's coming out in the summer. They're pushing that out as well. So yeah, they're really good press. You hear of a lot of presses not necessarily treating writers correctly. I've
I can
experienced
speak up on
that.
that. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's definitely
I've
happened.
been through that. But Bridget's, they're relatively new, but they treat you right. They've got ambitions. They've got finance, because it's a long held ambition. They work on publicity and marketing and all that sort of thing. So yeah, you've got to put your effort into it as well to help push your books out. But they're there, and I think what I like about them is that they're there for the story. So they will put out all sorts of things. At the minute, it's very much dark or speculative fiction. I know they'd like to broaden in the end, but the story comes first for them. So if you've got a story that doesn't quite fit certain horror publishers, then I would try them. But they've been very good. And as I say, I've been doing some work for them on the formatting and proofreading side as well. And the work that I've read, so some of it not all of it is to my taste, but but it is really good quality.
It's
It is
well
the
told,
story.
even if it's not specifically what you'd pick for your theme or subject matter.
Pardon? Sorry.
It's not what you'd pick for your theme or subject matter, but it's well told.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And that always appeals to me, because occasionally they'll say, oh, this might be a bit explicit, and I'll say, okay, because it's not necessarily the books I would pick up to read, but I'll read it and I think, actually, this is really good. And it's like there's this thing for weird westerns, isn't there? It's sort of grown in the past few years, and westerns to me growing up were all the John Wayne films and things like that, and we had to read, I don't know, Shane or something, I don't know, at school, and it just left me cold. And then I started reading these stories that have come through. T.C. Parker did one, Salvation Springs, that wasn't with Bridget's Gate. And then Bridget's Gate did the anthologies, sort of Weird West anthology, and they've had a couple through, I'm going to say Melissa West, and that's probably the wrong name, Gunslinger, that's Casey Griffin's, and then Hunger's as Old as the Land by Zachary Rosenberg. Those are westerns, and I really enjoyed those. So now I do actually look out for a book that may be a western. I'm Coy Hall. He's written folk horror, but he also put out Hungers of the Jackal. Or, that's probably totally the wrong title, but Jackal was in the title. I should have made a note before I came on, but that was really good as well. So westerns, yeah, something that used to leave me cold, I enjoy. So if the story is well told, and it's put in front of me and I read it, it's a way of getting me into another genre, actually. So I quite enjoy that. But
I
it's
kind of
a
like westerns when they aren't really written by the typical western author, like Richard Matheson, who wrote I Am Legend. So when
yeah.
he wrote a couple of westerns, it's like they're pretty amazing. You know, probably he has like a different perspective. He's not like
Mm.
idealizing things that you know that I'm just not into.
Yeah. So I read Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian,
Yeah.
because I hadn't read that before, and I thought,
Have you read The
oh,
Road?
it's quite violent. And I thought, oh yeah, I actually enjoyed that.
Have you read The Road?
Yes, that's what I went to Blood Meridian because it'd been recommended, and I did enjoy the road. So I got that, and then I got All the Pretty Horses, but that one didn't quite grab me in the same way that Blood Meridian did. So yeah, I'm quite open as to what I'll read these days, which is surprising. People think that as you get older, you get stuck in a rut, but I'm quite open about, open-minded to read all sorts of things, as long as the story is well told. I'll generally enjoy it, which is quite good. I got piles of books around me.
Well, some people try to stick with the genre, like I'm the Lovecraft guy, or I'm the this guy, or I'm the that guy. Do you have a theme that you try and stick by, or are you pretty open?
I'm pretty open. I don't want to, I love writing folk horror, but I also like writing the gothic, and I like writing post-apocalyptic type books as well. They're not out yet. One day I hope to get them out, but I don't want to be known for a particular subgenre or genre, because otherwise I think you could get bored, and if you get bored you'll bore other people. I like to tell stories, and that's what I'd like to be thought of as, somebody who can tell a good story. And there are authors out there, I usually say, like Jonathan Mabry. He's sort of stretched across all sorts of genres, but you know that he's going to tell a good story. You don't have to narrow yourself down to one particular theme or one particular brand, because everyone keeps saying, oh, you're an author, you've got to build your brand so people will recognize you, they'll know that you'll write this. But I'd rather they just recognize me as a good storyteller and are open to the different types of stories that I will put out. I won't write any romance. I'll let people know that now. They're safe from that. I'm rubbish at that. But if it's dark or maybe a bit historical or poetry, dark poetry, then that's quite a broad field. I'd like to people to just think, yeah, she can tell a story.
When you write, do you have certain patterns that you stick by? Like some people are trying to stick more by like the Shakespeare iambic pentameter sort of format. Some people run these long, complicated sentences. You're like, I can't even breathe when I read the sentences. Some people like first person, some people like third person. Tell me a little bit about your process.
Uh, well, like everything else, it's make it up as you go along. The length of sentences, it will vary according to the type of story that I'm writing. I've learned that within this genre, Kenneth Kane has been my editor on a few occasions, and he's sort of honed my sentences down a bit. So it depends on the pace of a particular part of the story. I don't get too prosy, I don't get too literary, but I do like to write more description in than you would find in some sort of horror books. Some people have called it literary horror with mine, but I like to have some description and I like to have some dialogue. But that's the thing that gets me when I'm writing. It may be that I'm writing chunks of description and then I'm thinking, well, how can I bring in the dialogue? I'm writing lots of dialogue and thinking, hang on, it can't just be dialogue, it's got to be other things. So I go back and work my way through it to balance it out. That is more instinctive than trying to fit any particular pattern. If you go on to the poetry, then that is just very much free verse, although I'm doing some sonnets as well, some horror sonnets, which is an experience for me. But I do like to play with language. I love language. I like to throw in a few new words, but I know that people will shout if I use anything that's a bit too obscure or whatever. But then I read somebody like T.C. Parker, I mentioned her earlier, and she throws in words like Hummingbird is her latest, which is really good. And she'll throw words in there that I've never heard of, but I can get the gist. I can work it out from the sentences. And I keep thinking, well, she could do it. Why can't I? Why do people complain if I do it? So maybe it's the way you tell things. But so yeah, I play around with language. I'm always worried about the narrative as to the descriptive versus the dialogue balance, even though I always make sure they move the story along so it's not there for the sake of it. And when it comes to voices, I'm usually third person and it's usually more than one character. I try to write first person and I can't. It's just not, it doesn't come easily to me, maybe because I haven't done it that much. But I find it restrictive. I like to know more about what's going on in other parts of the story. So you've got your character trotting along doing his thing, but that only sends you on one narrow path. If you get other characters in, it gives you a broader picture of what's going on. And sometimes it helps you cheat a little bit if you don't really want to describe too much. You can go to this other person, have things going on, go back to the other one, and then lo and behold, they've gone past this point where you're a bit stuck.
Well, some people like that whole omniscient narrator bit. Like
Yeah.
they need everything explained. Which actually I think if you explain too much, you kind of rob it of its intensity. Like,
Yeah.
Star Wars and the Jedi, and then all of a sudden they go, oh well, it's midichlorians in the blood, and they ruined it. It's like
Yeah.
you just have mystery. I don't think you need to bring all that into it.
Yeah, I don't. If I do have more than I think about three characters is the most that I usually have for a particular book. I think with Five Turns, it was just a couple. With the historical one I've done at the moment, I've got three. But usually there's one or two that are the stronger voices. The third is usually just a quieter one in the background. Pause, that was just one, obviously, because it's a novella. If it's a novella, you don't need lots of different viewpoints. It depends on the story, but never more than, two or three, because for me anyway, because otherwise that dilutes it down a little bit too much and you lose the tension and the pace. So I try and play them off against each other a little bit, and then they gradually converge towards the end.
Okay. One other question I'd ask about it too was, what do you do as far as promotion? Because I know whether you're on, a huge publishing company or a small publishing company, until you have the sales, nobody really pays attention. Even the giant company is not really going to push you unless you already have the sales. And have the sales, you need to get your stuff out there and you need to get people interested in what you're doing. How do you go about doing that?
Painfully. Yeah, over the years, I've been doing this for several years now, and it's been hard. I've not found any particular easy way to do it. Yes, I'm present on social media, and yes, I'll share my work and hope that others will share it. And I drop in on, like, on a Friday, you've got Gabino Iglesias who does his writer's boost for everybody, which is a good promo thing. And you'll try and do interviews and what have you, but it is very much an uphill battle. Horror, I'm going to throw a shout out here to Horrortree, Stuart Conover's Horrortree. I've been there for about 5 years now. I was there initially as co-editor of their Trembling with Fear zine online, but in the past couple of years we do an indie bookshelf release. It's a weekly thing that comes out on Friday, and it's free for writers. All they have to do is send me their book jacket, the cover of their book, and a link if they've got one, and I'll put it on the bookshelf. So on a Friday there'll be a poster, and it'll just be the covers of all the books for a particular month. So if you've had a book out within the past month or so, that'll go up. And then months ahead, I think I've got books on the shelf through to June of this year now. I've even put my own up there, which is quite nice feeling. But it's finding little things like that, aspects of the industry where other people will support you. I know that Bridgesgate have been really good, and they've actually employed a publicist, which is helping. I've not had that with other small presses. So it can be luck as to whether you get noticed, but it's also finding out who's out there and who can help you. And so I keep telling people about Horrortree, and it does have quite a reach, because it puts all the submission calls out, and it does reviews and interviews and various things for authors. And this is a bit of free promo that could use that reach that they've got. And people keep forgetting to send me their books.
So people should pay attention. Wait, what is it? Is it the website horrortree.com?
Horrortree.com. Yeah, it's run by Stuart Conover. It's one of the first sites I discovered when I started writing, because that's where I found the calls for short stories, for novels, novellas, everything like that. That's at Horrortree, and it's a bit of a go-to place for authors, and I'd highly recommend it. And there's articles on there. You can do a guest post if you want to as a writer. You can share blog posts. They publish flash fiction you can send into their zine. There's all sorts on there. I'd say it's one of the main sites that people should go to if they're a genre writer. Although it's called Horrortree, it is speculative fiction. So if you've got a dark fantasy or dark sci-fi, poetry, that anything like that, send
Right.
it.
Well, the labels are kind of subjective in ways. Like if you've seen like Event Horizon, there's space horror, and some people say no, there's sci-fi, and some people say no, it's horror. It can fit a whole bunch of molds.
Yeah, but all those calls, you will find that publishers send their calls to Stuart, and he puts them up on Horrortree. And then if you're looking for somewhere to send your work, or for some sort of inspiration, looking for a call, then you can go there and find something. And I think it's through them that I found my place in the community, and I became known. I would say that another way to become known is also not just to network, but to read other people's work, to share their work, to support them, and that in turn will feed back into your own work, and people will support you and help you on your own journey. So it's not climbing all over other people to get anywhere. It's trying to achieve your best, but also working with the people around you and helping them as well. I've made some, good friends, whether online or in real life, in this particular little genre, because the horror genre is quite small, I think, in the indie world. You do get to know people, and they're very supportive. And so if you're writing...
Well, unless you're like Stephen King or Joe Hill or, Dean Arcus, like one of the huge sellers, yeah.
Yeah, but in our own little sort of indie, with the smaller, you recognize people, and if you can help them, do, because it comes back to you as well. There's room for everybody. Some say, oh, we're not competition with each other. There's a little competitive element. I think everybody would admit that. But we're also all different. We read different things. We're all subjective in our own ways. I know not everybody likes my writing, and I don't like all the books that are out there. But I love writing and I love reading, and there's room for all different types, because otherwise what books will be produced? There's space for everybody. So I think everybody should help each other. And if you do help people and support others, that will be repaid. Just don't be one of those people that uses others to get further. Right, they'll talk to you for a little bit online.
Like stepping stones.
Yeah. Don't do that. Be one of the good guys, and like you.
Well, thank you. Well, I try and be a good guy. I don't know. You got to talk to my girlfriend. She might have a more thorough perspective on that. But yeah, so let's wrap this up. I don't want to keep you here all day, but how can everybody get a hold of you, and how can they see your work?
Well, I do have a website, www.stephanieellis.org. I always get the end wrong, but Stephanie Ellis is all one word, no spaces in that. My works, there's links to my work there, but if you go to bridgetsgatepress.com, you'll find my work there as well, and it will have maybe different links, because the links on my site tend to go to Amazon, but on Bridget's Gate they'll have links that might take you to Nook or Kobo or somewhere else. Poetry you'll find on my site, because that's self-published. That if I want to write something and put it out, I will, and that's even harder to publicize, I will say. So that's my website. I'm on Twitter mainly.
Watch you put out a compilation of your poetry, and that'll be like a massive seller.
One day people might use it as a doorstop or something, maybe, I don't know, but poetry is my happy place, and I really enjoy writing. That's why I've done it, and I'm not going to just wait around for an opening in the presses to put it out. We'll see what happens. If people don't like it, they don't like it. But I'm on Twitter usually rather than Facebook, and that's Stevie. That's EL, and then it's _Stevie, mainly because my mum and dad called me Stevie as a kid. They're the only people that do. my immediate family call me Stevie. Everyone else, it's Steph. Yeah, I'm on Facebook and Instagram. If you just search, you'll find me there. So yeah, Twitter mainly, but feel free for people to talk to me, to send me their book covers for Horror Tree. Yeah.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thanks for doing this interview. I appreciate it, and we'll let you know when it gets posted. But again, thank you.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.